Before the third game in any series ever tries to top its predecessors, or do anything new with the established series so far it's business as usual but with a few improvements. That's not a bad thought process to have as a game developer going into what should be the third game of a promising series, as the last thing you want is for the newest entry to be a radical departure of the previous two games. But what happens if your series has an amazing first game but a stinker of a sequel? Most series can never recover from that. However, that didn't stop Infogrames from making a third Alone in the Dark. Now, if this is your first time watching one of my reviews on the Alone in the Dark series, then I suggest you start with my reviews of the first and second game. The reason why is there are a lot of aspects from the first game that apply to the second and third game, and I don't want to keep repeating the same facts and information again over and over. So if you just finished watching them or have already watched them, then let's continue right where we left off at the end of the last review. So, did Alone in the Dark 3 right the ship and return this series to its former glory? Not exactly, but it was a good attempt to do so. Alone in the Dark 3 continues the more action-oriented style of the second game, while shifting some of the focus back onto solving puzzles. Focusing more on puzzles is certainly a step in the right direction, but that's not where the second game went wrong, and that's not why the first game was so good. The reason why the first game was so good was its emphasis on traditional horror and not relying on cheap jump scares as most modern horror video games do. It truly was a game deserving of its title. So, let's get one huge negative out of the way with before we focus on the rest of this game. I love the simple story setup of the first game, as it gives you just enough story to explain why you're at this mansion and then stuff happens and you're left to deal with it. This is the perfect example of underplaying a story so that the story doesn't become centre stage and overshadow the whole experience, while still leaving plenty of room for self-interpretation of it. I believe that's part of the reason why the first game was so scary, and as I've always said, there's nothing more scary than your own imagination. And then we get Alone in the Dark 2 and its story was a mixed bag. I loved the backstory to Jack and Elizabeth and the rest of the former pirate turned gangsters, but the problem with this amazing backstory to the villains is it makes our protagonists a joke in comparison. In the second game, we're meant to believe Edward, this man in his late 30s, became in a few short months a full-blown supernatural private eye. You'd think to be deserving of that title, it would take years of investigating the supernatural. Heck, even Fox Mulder was investigating the X-Files sometime before Scully became his partner. Then we get the third Alone in the Dark, and I felt that Infogrames tried to come to some balance and story structure so that the villain's story was still engaging, but didn't outdo Edward's, while also trying to give him a more believable start and some character development. Did they succeed in any of these areas? Nope. They didn't even come close. The third game starts off with Edward in his office, and then, well, I'll just show you the rest as it's right at the beginning of the game and it spoils nothing.
Shoot, that rat of a landlord has cut the picture again. Carnby.
Greg Saunders, Hill Century.
Cut it short, Greg, I've got problems.
You're onto a new case?
No, not really, no. I'm alone in the dark.
That remark from Edward about being alone in the dark is as cheesy as anything, but it made me laugh. I love it when a game is hinting that it's self-aware of itself. So by the time the phone call ends, our hero is hired and is sent off to his next investigation at this abandoned old Wild West film set. This is where our hero's adventure begins, and other than one crucial plot point later, Edward's character development grinds to a halt. If you're going to give a character a decent backstory and a compelling story setup, then go all out or don't bother. This is why the first game's story setup works, because it was so simple and effective. They should just use this approach for the second and third game. Oh well, you would at least be able to think after the amazing backstory to the villains in the second game, they'd be able to repeat this feat again. After finishing this game, I was left with two questions. Who the hell was the villain, and if there was one, what on earth was his motive? I followed the story as best I could and took every chance to read any literature that might give me some additional insight, and I was still drawing a blank. I think this problem goes back to the second game. The villain's backstory was so good that it actually overshadowed Edward's and made his a joke. Let me reiterate, playing the third game in the Alone in the Dark series, I felt the developers had acknowledged their mistake in the second game and did try to rectify it with the third one. But all they did was create a game that started off fairly well with the character development of Edward. And did they follow up on it throughout the rest of the game? No. And the villain, again, who was he and what did he want? I know this aspect may seem like a game breaker, but it depends on how you look at it. If you can go about this game in the same way you would approach the first one, then it becomes a little more enjoyable. But it's hard to do that when the series is clearly pushing towards a more traditional story narrative instead of the simple make-up-as-you-go-along approach of the first game. I know what you're thinking now. Michael, at least tell us the gameplay in this is an improvement over the second game. Well, I'm happy to confirm the gameplay in this fixes every issue I had with the second game, but it does add one new problem though: jumping. Fair enough, Alone in the Dark was the first game to create the whole tank control survival horror thing, and years before Resident Evil ever did its take on it. So I guess the do's and don'ts of this style of game hadn't been established yet. Even still, who would have thought jumping in Alone in the Dark 3 would be a good idea? Before I worked out what to do, I must have died like 30 times, and when I did work out what to do, I must have died on like every other jump I took. For a successful jump, you have to make sure you're right in the middle of a platform and then jumping exactly off of it forward onto the next one, or it's game over again. So I would suggest saving after each successful jump. Apart from this one complaint, the gameplay as a whole is an improvement and does address every issue with the second game. First off, you now have a choice of 3 difficulties with additional options so you can tweak the different aspects of the difficulty so you can have a more comfortable challenge of your own choosing. Considering how difficult the second game was, I wasn't going to take any chances, so I just kept it on easy. Second, the enemies don't gang up on you this time round, and you never have to face any more than 1 or 2, maybe 3 max. And last, and the biggest improvement, is the game comes off a lot more polished and doesn't feel buggy like its predecessor, so yay for playtesters! I know it doesn't seem like Infogrames made that many changes with this game, and if truth be told they didn't, but the few minor changes they made actually make this a fun playable game and not a frustrating experience like the second game was. And if the story in this had been as good as the second game, this game would have had a chance of coming close to the greatness of the first game. But character development, story and gameplay aside, how did the graphics in this compare with the previous 2 games? The look of this game is interesting and feels like a blend of the visuals from the previous 2 games. The first one looked great for its time and really gives you the creeps, but the colour palette used made everywhere look kind of the same. While the second game avoids this problem, it did create another one as each location was such a departure from the previous one. Even still, the locations were rich with colour and had lots of detail to them. But there just wasn't much continuity from one area to the next, and every place you went to felt so different from the last. The third game nails it and gets the balance just right. Every room and location has its own character, but still fit into the grander picture of this town. The soundtrack in this, like the previous game, doesn't have that many standout tunes, but judged only as background music, it does an excellent job of giving this game a creepy atmosphere that keeps you constantly on the edge and never lets up. And that rockin' end tune in the credits was a nice touch. I think we can all agree this is by far the best looking game in the original Alone in the Dark trilogy. It has some solid gameplay apart from the jumping section, but doesn't quite have the charm of the original Alone in the Dark. I don't think it helps that these 2 games were made in such a short period of time, and that might have been the reason why Infogrames decided to give this series a rest, as they did all they could with the original Alone in the Dark 3D engine, which by '94 was well and truly out of date. It would take new technology and some reinvestment of time, money and fresh ideas by Infogrames to truly bring this series back to its roots and also revitalise it. I don't think they were prepared to do it at the time, not when the gaming landscape was about to drastically change, but it was these developments over the next few years that would indirectly bring about the next chapter in the Alone in the Dark series. So let's take a trip back to the mid-90s. In '94, the same year that Alone in the Dark 3 was released for DOS, the PlayStation made its debut in Japan and by next year was available everywhere else in the world. You might be asking, why is this relevant? Well, before the PlayStation, 3D was a niche market and was considered too time consuming and expensive to be profitable. The PlayStation changed that and brought about a whole new era of gaming. It was also the same year that Capcom started work on Resident Evil. In 95, Windows 95 was released and became in itself a gaming platform that would make PC gaming more mainstream and common. Before Windows 95, you used to have to use DOS, and it was not the most friendly gaming platform. Because of that, the original Alone in the Dark trilogy was not an experience that everyone could partake in unless you were a computer geek, and that did limit the series' potential audience. Later in 95, Resident Evil was starting to gain buzz, and Infogrames took notice. You can imagine what happened in late 95. Some executive at Infogrames saw a preview of Resident Evil and were like, "Wait a minute, we invented the style of gaming years ago. Those buggers! We will show them how it's done." So in 96, to cash in on the hype of Resident Evil, Infogrames released Alone in the Dark: Jack is Back in Europe, and renamed it Alone in the Dark: One-Eyed Jack's Revenge in North America. This was an updated version of Alone in the Dark 2 with slightly better 3D graphics, unchanged gameplay, and extra unneeded FMVs. Alone in the Dark 2 and 3 rated well on DOS, and a lot of that had to do with how amazing the first game was, and because of that, it blinded a lot of critics at the time to the faults of the second and third game. But because gamers on the PlayStation and Saturn had not experienced the first game, they saw this for what it was, an okay game with problems. Now Gamer gave this a rating of 77% and said, set against the immediate Resident Evil, this seems dated. IGN gave this a score of 60 and said, these problems aside, Alone in the Dark isn't a bad game, it just doesn't hold a candle to newer, better games. And finally, the official UK Sega Saturn magazine gave this a 54% and said, what starts out as an intriguing RPG is quickly ruined by major flaws in the game logic, leading to the kind of frustration that makes you want to kill fluffy animals. Why did Infogrames re-release a slightly tweaked version of Alone in the Dark 2 instead of making a new version of the first game to introduce this series to a whole new audience of console gamers? The re-release of the second Alone in the Dark would be unsuccessful, and Resident Evil would become a smash hit and take the crown of survival horror. The original and director's cut of the first Resident Evil would go on to sell just short of 4 million copies. And 5 years later, Capcom made another 3 Resident Evil games, and up to 2002 the core Resident Evil series had sold 17 million units worldwide. I don't have any sales numbers to back this up, but I'm guessing the original Alone in the Dark trilogy and the re-release of the second game didn't sell anywhere close to the numbers. Infogrames had learnt its mistakes with the re-release of Alone in the Dark 2 and decided to give this series another shot at the height of the popularity of the survival horror genre. So in 2001, 7 years after the third game, the next chapter in this series was unleashed to the world. Would this new game in the Alone in the Dark series be able to retake the crown of survival horror that Infogrames themselves invented with the first Alone in the Dark all them years ago? Find out my review of Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare. So, my final thoughts. Alone in the Dark 3 is a step forward and a step back. It fixes some of the problems of the second game, but sadly adds a couple of its own. I had high hopes for this game, but I was left just as disappointed with this game as I was with the second one. So I have no choice but to give this game and this series another thumbs down. If you've never played any of these games, then I would suggest getting them from GOG. The first game often goes on sale, and it also includes the second and third game for free, so if you want to play the first game but also try your hand at the sequels, then this is the best way to go. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon for the next nightmare.